Hi, folks. Welcome to week number 8 of English 261. This week we'll be talking about the Irish poets. Before we do that, just so you know, I'm recording from my office here, so hopefully you can see me and also my screen at the same time. If not, I do apologize, but what I'm saying is stuff you could probably take notes on fairly easily. So one thing I did want to point out to you before we start is if you look under Week 7, The Romantics and the Americans Part 2, Week 7, Lecture B, Part B is now posted. I do sincerely apologize it took me so long to get that posted, but unfortunately because of the gas leak and a variety of other reasons, such as some problems with my home recordings, I was not able to get this done any quicker than now. So it is taken care of at this point. So Week 7, Lecture B, the wrap-up of the Romantics and the Early Americans is there for you to check out. So please do check that out, look it over, and see what you kind of cover some of the last poems that we covered for that section. Today, though, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the Irish poets. So if you hear me flipping through pages, it's me flipping through my notes, trying to find out where I got started. Yes, let's see here. Flip, flip. Okay, so we started with William Butler Yeats, and William Butler Yeats, I'll be honest, is kind of like Whitman. He's one of my favorite poets for a variety of reasons, and one of the reasons I actually decided I wanted to do something with Irish poetry this week, not only because St. Patrick's Day is here, but also because there's something interesting about Irish poetry, because Irish poetry is it's technically poetry in English, but it's also written in a way that's different, and it has a different kind of feel than English poetry does to some extent on a lot of levels. And I think it's partly because Ireland as a nation is quite a bit different from the United Kingdom for a variety of reasons, but also because the Irish, generally speaking, through a lot of the 20th century and especially the 18th and the 19th century, spoke a separate language from English. They spoke Gaelic as well. So you're dealing with a group of people or a nation of people who are bilingual, and because of that, their English is inflected in different ways. And there's actually, if you look at Gaelic, there's some really interesting uses and phrasings of words that are very kind of different from English. Such as a good example is one of the things in Gaelic, instead of saying "I am sad," you say "the sadness is upon me," which actually, if you think about it psychologically, actually creates a very interesting separation between the emotion of the person, where it doesn't encourage you to actually identify yourself as sadness or being a sad person, but being aware that an emotion is a passing state. So it's kind of an interesting difference in language and the difference in use of language. And one of the things is generally kind of recognized and agreed upon is that Irish is a very kind of musical language, and there's something about Gaelic in particular in the way that even the Irish pronounce English wording that has a musical kind of quality to it that is very poetic on some level. So I think looking at the Irish is a little bit separate from the English, I think is worthwhile as an experience for discussing in the material. Okay? So we'll start with William Butler Yeats, who's probably probably one of the most famous Irish poets, right up there with George Bernard Shaw. But Yeats he was really kind of an interesting figure because he came kind of between the Victorians and the modernists, and he kind of bridged the gap between the two, though he did have some romantic kind of qualities to his work. And one of the things I've always liked about Yeats is that Yeats was in many ways an Irish nationalist, and he was very, very interested in the history of Ireland and what the Irish people, how they differed from the United Kingdom, and also in their mythologies and their beliefs that were different from their England. So when he writes, he wrote very frequently about Irish kind of mythological elements and Irish kind of stories. And if you take a look at the Stolen Child is actually very much a narrative of the kidnapping of a child by the fairy. And the Stolen Child and there's the refrain of the fairies speaking to the human child. And one of the things that the Irish believed was they believed in what was called the Fae. And the Fae were the fairy. They lived in the land of Arcadia. Oberon and Titania, of course, and Midsummer's Night's Dream deal with the Fae. It's a very old myth of the English Isles. And the Irish had a very strong interest in the Fae. And there was a belief that the Fae would actually kidnap human children. And one of the things that kind of happens here is you get these really beautiful descriptions of the Irish landscape that Yeats gives us in the poem. But then there's also the idea that by taking this child away before their adulthood, the Fae are actually saving him from a life of suffering and a life of unhappiness. That ultimately what human life is. So there's a really kind of interesting idea, and generally speaking, the Fae were always the English were always warned that the Fae would steal their children, and Yeats is kind of saying in this case, but you know what? Maybe that's not a terrible thing because the child will never have to suffer. And given the fact that Ireland frequently throughout history suffered famines and a variety of other disasters and problems that made life there very difficult for the inhabitants of the Irish islands. There's something very telling in the fact that Yeats says, but if a child is taken when it's young, it's away from weeping and suffering that adulthood brings, and that life brings, and that famine can bring, and that our situation can bring, and the circumstances they grow up in can bring. So there's kind of an interesting twist on that idea of something that people are warned against might actually be for the best for the child is to be taken by the fairy. So I think that's one of the things that's interesting here, and I think he makes a great use of refrain, and it has a very kind of fairy tale quality to it. But also, through all this, he writes these beautiful little uses of for the kettle on the hob and the barn mice bob, and just very kind of different words than you would find in very kind of traditional English poetry. He uses Irish vernacular or Irish slang or in Cockney and things like that far more often than other poets do, and I think it adds something to that poem. And if you take a look at the Second Coming, this is really kind of a high modernist, or at least a reference strongly to the modernist idea that there's something fallen about the world, or there's something not functioning about the world. And the Second Coming is actually a very, very famous poem, and it's extensively referenced in all throughout literature. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, near anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. There's the overall idea that there's something very, very wrong with the world, and this in many ways came out of the idea of empire and the powers of empire and things, and it also came to some extent from World War One, and the approach of World War One and what was actually happening in the world at the time. There was an idea that the world was a fallen place, and partly this was because, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about modernism, World War One was the bloodiest, most vicious battle that anyone on the planet had seen up until that time, because it was so technologically advanced that people were able to kill mass amounts of people at once. It was the first time we saw trench warfare. It was the first time we saw chemical warfare, and it was really disheartening for an entire generation of people to realize what kind of barbarism still existed in a world that we perceive to be modern. And that's very much kind of what the Second Coming is about here. It's what Yeats is kind of getting at when he writes the Second Coming. But it's a very, very famous poem, and it's possibly Yeats' most famous, and it's possibly one of the more famous poems of the modernist era. So I thought it was worth bringing out. And there's also a lot of literary allusion here. One of the things about Yeats that was worth mentioning is Yeats was a member of what was called the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was actually a group of hermetic sorcerers. They believed in they were occultists who believed in the kind of old sorcery and rituals and things like that prior to it being taken over by Aleister Crowley later on in his life. So to some extent, Yeats was very interested in the occult. He was something of an occultist. Many people actually were in that time, much as the same way that many people were Freemasons in the time, and that kind of had rituals and things along with that, associate that. But the Order of the Golden Dawn was a little bit more focused on occultism than a lot of the other groups were in. Yeats was a member. So he was very interested in the idea of that kind of imagery, and a lot of that appears in his work. So Seamus Heaney is the next writer I gave us, and Seamus Heaney is really he's one of the most important English poets of the modern English language poets of modern times, and he's one of the best known. And if there are very, very few poets nowadays who are known in the popular mind, and Seamus Heaney would be one of those. Probably Seamus Heaney, Billy Collins, Maya Angelou, some few poets like that, but Seamus Heaney is definitely up there. And as a matter of fact, at the beginning of the semester, we read Seamus Heaney when we read Beowulf because we were reading his translation of it. And one of the things that Seamus Heaney was known for was his translations. Um, Seamus Heaney is quite a master at. He really wrote about his environment growing up in Ireland. He did not write. He wrote a lot about his home even long after he left it, and he wrote a lot about kind of the natural environment of his home and the people in his home. And he was very, in a lot of ways, interested in kind of an everyday experience of the Irish people, as opposed to any kind of particular over idea or any kind of particular over education or focus on any specific wealthy or powerful group of individuals. He never quite became as urbane as his life would have led you to believe because he spent a fair amount of time outside of Ireland, but he was always to some extent writing about Ireland. He was one of those writers who never really quite, his home never quite leaves him. And that's actually something we'll kind of notice as a bit of a trend for the Irish writers we're talking about here today. Sorry, I'm trying to find Haney poems in my book. Here we go. I had you read Digging and A Dream of Jealousy, so 1179. And Digging, I think, is a really great example of what I was talking about with the idea that that Haney never really left his home. Because here, even now, he's talking about his grandfather and his father, and they're digging and they're farming. And he was not from a wealthy family by any means whatsoever. And what he's doing here in this poem, first of all, the images are very, very strong here. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging, I look down till a straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away. Stooping in rhythm through potato drills, or he was digging. There's just really kind of good, precise use of words and really strong rhythm and kind of good rhyming effects quality in his Haney's writing. And Haney's very much kind of a lyric poet in a very kind of older sense than we might have been used to, but he's very much into, he uses kind of formal structures in a way that a lot of poets of his time weren't doing, and I think it adds something to the tone of his work. It recalls kind of an earlier poetic period in much as the way his work recalls kind of an earlier kind of idle or natural world than what he was actually dealing with in 1939. But there's kind of country home quality to it that I think ultimately is fit with the form, but also fits very well with the content he's using here. But what he's doing here in Digging is between my finger and thumb, my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun, and he's comparing what he's doing, how his father and how his grandfather dug to sustain themselves, is how he's digging with language and digging with poetry, and how their work is his work in some way because he in his own way is digging even though he's not physically digging. So he's making a connection between what his ancestors did and what he did, but also recognizing that his ancestors were doing it in a very much more physical way where he's digging in a very kind of different way and digging into his past experiences. But it's kind of that connection between the two I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it's also interesting because what he's saying here is that he's applying the values of hard work and the ethic of hard work that he learned from his father and grandfather to his art, and that's kind of what he's saying makes him successful. He's digging with his pen. And if you take a look at A Dream of Jealousy, you'll notice that it's just kind of a very, not a whole heck of a lot of any kind of deeper meaning, but just it's almost kind of a beautiful capturing of an actual dream or an actual moment in a dream that it has that kind of surreal quality that dreams do, where you're doing things you wouldn't imagine yourself doing or capable of doing. And in some ways it speaks to the idea of how people might find themselves feeling if they're engaged in adultery. How do you feel if you're doing things and knowingly hurting someone that you wouldn't knowingly hurt, or you find yourself knowingly doing something you wouldn't think you were doing? And is there a distance in that? And I think there's kind of an interesting idea that A Dream of Jealousy, what it's kind of saying about adultery and how people relate to one another, and how we kind of, to some extent, often find ourselves doing things to people we don't necessarily intend to do. And I think it's kind of the idea it's just kind of an interesting way of kind of looking at that, is kind of giving you a dreamlike little kind of quality to get at the emotional experience behind it. So I thought that was an interesting one as well. So Yevon Boland, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, is also an Irish poet, and she's also an activist. She teaches at Feminist, and she has very kind of literary poems. They're very, very intelligent, and they're very well educated. They're very full of allusions, and but they're often. She's also very much a feminist, and her poems often very much address feminine and women's issues. And the poem she has in here, let's see if I can find it off the top of my head. Let me go look in the book here. Sorry. We're bouncing around a lot this week, so I can't just rely quite as much as I usually do on the order of the text. Ah, 1206. Okay. The science of cartography is limited. So this is kind of a really interesting poem because the cartography is the science of map making, and really what Boland is looking at here is the way that maps and our understandings of places are not rooted anywhere near as much in history or what we actually do as they are in just ideas or concepts. And she really kind of digs into the fact that a map can never say as much about a place as actually knowing the place and actually being there. And you can kind of see that through the science of cartography, and not simply by the fact that the shading of forest cannot show the fragrance of balsam. The gloom of cypresses is what I wish to prove. When you and I were first in love, we drove to the borders of kind of. There's a history that's beyond what's labeled on a map. There's places are much more rich than their names and their locations and the cartographies and the way we kind of order our worlds. And I think she's digging at an idea that there's nothing that a map can do there's nothing that the science of a map can do that can capture the reality of a lived experience in a place. And I think it's kind of a lovely way of saying that. And you can tell she's got some really lovely details and image here. I looked down at the ivy and the scotch grass. Rathscastone had disappeared into, as you told me, in the second winter of their ordeal in 1847, and the crop had failed twice. Just beautiful details about living an experience and hearing about history in this place, and how none of that's recorded by a map. And it's, to some extent, she laments the idea that these maps that people look at when they look at the place and say, well, this is here was what this is, and imagine what that place is, it has nothing to do with the actual place and not knowing the history of a place, because a map can't carry the history in the way the people who have been there, who have experienced it, can. And I think to some extent it could be read as possibly a critique of tourism, where people look at maps and postcards and think, oh, look at these beautiful places, not knowing the history or the suffering or the reality of the situation behind them. So I think that's kind of what is being looked at here, and I think she does a very kind of good job of doing that. Paul Muldoon, the third epistle of Timony. Paul Muldoon's an interesting figure as well, also an Irish poet, but he's very, very, and he's almost in some ways very different from what Haney was. Haney was very interested in kind of capturing an everyday Irish experience, whereas Paul Muldoon was really, really interested in, he's very interested in illusion and complexity and literary kind of high-minded concept poetry. So whereas Haney kind of in some ways calls back an earlier time period in poetry when he writes, Muldoon is very much fully into the postmodern contemporary era, where poems are a bit more dense and a bit more difficult and much more written in illusions. There's a lot more of T.S. Eliot and Paul Muldoon than there is in Seamus Haney, and I think that's something we'll kind of talk about. Might not make sense to you yet, but it will when we talk about T.S. Eliot. But the third epistle to Timothy is a really, it's a long kind of detailed poem full of a lot of heavy allusions to Ireland's history, and in particular Ireland's history with sectarianism and the disputes with religion in Irish history. Whether you know it or not, Irish history is ultimately, in many ways, very much divided and still very much divided over religion, far less than it used to be now. But there were issues with disputes between the Irish Catholic and the Protestants who sided with the United Kingdom in most things, whereas the Irish Catholics, generally speaking, were often very nationalist and wanted to be separate from the nation, and were especially against the idea of any sort of state government. But you can kind of see this here, talking about his father's mistreatment at the hands of people who were had different religious beliefs with him, and it's very kind of dark and kind of bleak. And young Muldoon, see what spells you'll cast. Just the fact he was mistrusted and hated, and just the experience that he had to go through with that. And you can see there's all kinds of fantastic allegories and references here, and that's very much telling of Paul Muldoon's style. Muldoon is in ways, like I said, a lot more in line with T.S. Eliot and more contemporary poets than Seamus Heaney is, who kind of called back on an earlier poetic style. So I thought that was kind of worth looking at, but to some extent they're also interested in the same things, which is what the lives of people in Ireland are like. Also worth mentioning, Paul Muldoon has actually written music for Warren Zevon and the band called the Handsome Family, who did the theme song for True Detective, and he has also been in a number of rock bands, so he's kind of an interesting character in that regard. And then we go on to Oscar Wilde, and Oscar Wilde is an interesting figure and kind of one of my favorite figures, not necessarily for his work, but just for his kind of personality and the way he kind of lived his life. Wilde's an interesting guy. Oscar Wilde was a wit. He was kind of a bon vivant in Victorian England, and he was a playwright, he was an essayist, he was a critic, he was a poet. He was also a prose writer. The Portrait of Dorian Gray was written by Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde was very much... he was well known for heckling the upper class at the same time as he would absolutely adore their attention and would happily share his wit with them. He had the really interesting social position of being able to heckle people from the curb while still being part of the parade, and I always thought Oscar Wilde did an amazing job with that, if you look at his history. The other thing with Oscar Wilde is Oscar Wilde was eventually jailed very publicly for homosexuality. And he was imprisoned in Reading Jail for the act of... basically what happened was someone accused him of being homosexual. He took the case to court, and the judge ultimately found that he was in fact homosexual and basically sentenced him to prison for that because it was legal at the time. And it was a very big shock to Wilde, who had really not had to deal with consequences or repercussions of the things he'd done in his life, and kind of his bon vivancy. It was almost as if someone had finally said, well, now you've crossed the line because you messed with the upper crust just enough, and here's what you get for that. And he was basically imprisoned for being himself and doing the things that the culture had applauded him for a long, long time, until finally they decided they weren't going to applaud him for it anymore and sent him to prison. And the Ballad of Reading Jail is very much about that. It's very much one of Wilde's darker works, and it's very much kind of in keeping with older styles, and it in many ways calls back kind of darker, older types of writing that weren't really typical of Wilde, but Wilde might have fallen back to when he was in this situation that was so different from what he was used to in the course of his life. And the Ballad of Reading Jail is a very unhappy poem, and it really points out just the darkness of the situation and the cruelty of Irish prisons. And the fact that Wilde spent time in one is, given the way he lived up to that point prior, and given what he was ultimately imprisoned for, is really kind of heartbreaking that this is what ended up happening. And not long after he was out of prison, he was poor and penniless. Wilde passed away. He didn't live much longer past this. And as a matter of fact, the death of Oscar Wilde is where some people mark the beginning of the modernist period. So Oscar Wilde's The Ballad of Reading Jail is kind of a really long poem that really kind of details just the suffering of the people in Reading Jail, and also kind of reflects in many ways in Wilde's experience being exposed to such a different kind of lifestyle after living at the top of society for quite some time. James Joyce is, of course, the famous novelist. And also, he was a poet and he wrote poetry. James Joyce was really well known for capturing very experimental writer of fiction. He was the one who wrote in who tried to write whenever possible in stream of consciousness. Also, he was kind of a critic of how literature and thinker about a philosopher of how literature worked, and he gave us ideas like the objective correlative and things along those lines. And much like Seamus Heaney, he never really, despite the fact he spent most of his life abroad, he never really left Ireland. Most of his writing is about Ireland and about Dublin in particular, where he grew up, because there's something about Dublin that was very, very tied to Joyce, even though he left Dublin. And one of the things he said was he had to actually leave Dublin to better understand Dublin. And that's kind of what he was doing in a lot of his work. But A Flower Given to My Daughter and Night Piece are both they're both kind of interesting pieces to get from Joyce, especially A Flower Given to My Daughter, which is kind of a lovely little poem that is very not in keeping with what Joyce was doing in his literary work, which was very ambitious and very kind of wild and exuberant and overblown and strong and powerful. And A Flower Given to My Daughter is kind of a lovely little lyric poem he wrote. And I think it's very illustrative of, we tend to think that the writers who do experimental things, they don't know how to do other things, and I don't think that was the case with Joyce. Joyce knew what he was doing very, very well, and he knew what rules he was breaking when he was breaking them. And I think the same is true of Night Piece. I also wanted you to read those because I thought it was really interesting that the presentation I found them in was in the original journal format, so you can actually look at how they were when they were originally published the first time, and I thought that was kind of had a nice kind of flavor to it. Patrick Kavanagh, and we'll talk, and James Joyce, of course. If you ever taken 20th century British literature class, it's almost impossible that you are going to avoid reading James Joyce. He's a major figure in literature of the United Kingdom, English and Ireland, and he major modernist figure. So Patrick Kavanagh, I think, is an interesting poet, and one of the things I liked about one of the things I think is interesting about Patrick Kavanagh, and worth mentioning about Patrick Kavanagh, is Patrick Kavanagh spent most of his life unregarded as a poet, despite the fact he was actually quite good, and he wrote very much about his life, but also about the experience of being Irish in the early parts of the 20th century. And Kavanagh was not very well respected until towards the end of his life, and unfortunately the end of his life was much sooner probably than it should have been, because Kavanagh was an alcoholic. And he struggled with that, and a lot of that is actually in his poetry. So if you take a look at Memory of My Father, every old man I see reminds me of my father when he'd fall in love with death. One time when sheaves were gathered, the man I saw in Gardner Street, stumbling the curb was one. He stared at me half-eyed, I might have been his son. And I remember the musician faltering over his fiddle in Bayswater, London. He too set me the riddle. Every old man I see in October-colored weather seems to say to me, I was once your father. And in some extent you get the impression that his father lived a very happy life, and there's a fear that Kavanagh himself is leaving that lifestyle. And he recognizes his father in all these old men, but in some extent he also recognizes himself in that idea of falling in love with death. And Kavanagh, with his drinking problem, had a lot of different problems throughout the course of his life that were tied to that, and a lot of health problems tied to that. And sometimes in things like Memory of My Father, you see an awareness that he's going to end up unhappy and unfortunate like the people he's seeing here in The Memory of My Father. So I think that's a kind of an interesting piece for that regard, and I think it's got there's a kind of lovely sadness and some very just kind of sharp lines, such as I remember the musician faltering over his fiddle in Bayswater, London. I mean, just the really kind of sharp imagery of a musician holding a fiddle but just not being able to play, or the phrase when he'd fallen in love with his death. I thought that was just really kind of lovely imagery and lines in Kavanagh's work that I thought was worth sharing with you. And Come Dance with Kitty Stobling, and this one I think there's a loveliness to this as well. No, 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 I knew I was not important as I moved through the colorful country. I was but a single item in the picture, the name, not the beloved. O tedious man with whom no gods commingle. And this is in many ways I think a story about kind of losing yourself to love, but also emotional sickness and illness and mental illness. And I think the end, O dance with Kitty Stobling, I outrageously cried out assents to them, while their timorous paces stumbled behind Joe's page boy paging me. I had a very pleasant journey. Thank you sincerely for giving me my madness back, or nearly. And to some extent, too, there's also kind of just the idea of getting your madness back, of getting back that lovely feeling of being mad in the world and being in love with the world. That idea that you can get that back by dancing. He got that back from dancing with Kitty Stoling. Just lovely imagery here, and I think it's a very kind of strong poem that uses a lot of and I just love the way the kind of rhythm of it works because it feels almost like dancing, and I think that's something I always kind of liked about Kavanaugh's work, and I thought that was worth checking out. Okay, and the last poet I don't know a whole heck of a lot about is Eileen Carney Hulme. She was recommended to me by someone who is interested in Irish poetry in particular, so I put these on here. She's a modern contemporary poet, and I had to read a couple of her poems. And I think one of the things I really, really like about her is the sun exploded in her mouth and for a while colored her world orange. Just the kind of the imagery here. She's a very, very sharp with image and description, and I think that's telling for modern poets, and I think that she does a very good job with it. And the same thing with Shifting Karma. Shifting Karma, I just thought I wanted to tell you that in countless walks I've gathered these gifts, leaves, pebbles, a melted moon, and 3 leftover kisses from a picnic on the dunes. Just kind of lovely, kind of slight little rhymes. And the rhyme here, when there is rhyme, it's very, very carefully applied. It's not overt, it's not sharp, it's just kind of very slight little bits of rhyme here that don't really announce themselves. And I think that that's really kind of effective here, especially modern times when people are much more sensitive to rhymes than they used to be, to find ways to use rhyme that aren't quite so present but are really kind of quietly rhyming, and I think she does a really great job with that. I'm sorry, I'm kind of wrapping things up here a little bit because my voice is kind of starting to give from doing this 2 lectures in a row, so I think that pretty much covers the Irish poets, for the most part, at least what I want to say, because some of these figures are going to come back to us as we go back through and look at some other writers and things along those lines. As for what you need to do for this week, if you go ahead and take a look at the module, you will see that... Do not look behind the curtain here at the other ones. So this week, read selections for week 8. We're going to read the first parts of the Modernists, and I'd like you to take a look at the Villanelle. The Villanelle is a poetic form that ends with it has an extra refrain added into and it ends with a quatrain. It's so basically what it does. It extends the challenges they're on to and demands some additional lines in an added refrain. So it's kind of building on what we do. And the Villanelle is probably one of the more complex poems we get until we actually finally get to the sonnet, which we'll be working on here shortly. So all you need to do is write a Villanelle, and there's a really good example of one from Dylan Thomas, and it's probably my favorite of the Villanelles. I really, really love this poem. So I really recommend checking it out. If you have any questions or concerns, please get in touch. Otherwise, I would recommend for this week, just make sure you're keeping up with the critiques. We're critiquing the Rondeau this week. Make sure you're working that poetry analysis paper because it's going to be due here shortly. And make sure you get your Villanelle taken care of. I will be grading the poetry projects this week. They should be done by the beginning of next week, no later. I plan to have them done at the weekend at the absolute latest. So if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, take care, be well, and I will speak to you folks again in about 7 days. Take care and have a good one.